point. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Central Nova.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I'd like to point out that I do plan to share my time with the honourable member from Long Range Mountains, who's sitting just to my right here. Mr. Speaker, it's always an honour to rise and speak in this House on any issue that has the importance that it gets to the floor. But today I'm particularly excited because I have the opportunity to speak to an issue that I'm not only familiar with, but that I care about, inspired me to get involved in politics in the first place, and that impacts a region that I care about more than any other place on planet Earth, and that is Atlantic Canada. Mr. Speaker, today we're debating a motion in the House involving the appointment of Supreme Court justices, and namely the custom to appoint a Supreme Court judge to fill a vacancy that was left after the retirement of a judge from that same region. Mr. Speaker, this whole debate arises out of the new process that the Liberal government introduced to introduce an open and transparent process that is independent from the executive and nonpartisan in that it has a former progressive Conservative Prime Minister, and that's different, chairing the committee that's overseeing this whole operation. This is the kind of process that the International Commission of Jurists implored the previous government to introduce when it came to the appointment of Supreme Court justices. But, Mr. Speaker, if we set aside just for the moment, but I'll come back to it, the importance of regional diversity on the court, this process would be stellar. There would be no questions, and I expect it would not even be controversial enough to make it to the House because it would get universal support. However, on the issue of regional diversity, it is important, and I am supporting the motion for this reason. It's about federalism. Mr. Speaker, federalism is part of the constitutional fabric that makes Canada the country that it is. As discussed by the Supreme Court of Canada, an institution I deeply respect, they described it as a political tool that promotes diversity within our country and enhances national unity at the same time. And the Nadan reference, which I'll come back to again in a moment, the Supreme Court flagged that, it's not just about Section 5 and 6 of the Supreme Court Act that makes regional representation in government important. It's also about the understanding of legal traditions and social norms. You could supplant Nova Scotia's name where Quebec's is, and the argument would remain the same. And I do support regional diversity on the court, and I hope Atlantic Canada is represented on the court. This idea that 32 Atlantic MPs are silent when we're actively speaking out like this in the House of Commons is laughable and false. But, Mr. Speaker, what I really have to get to here, and this is the grand takeaway from my remarks, is that given the messenger, it is hard to take this criticism seriously when we had 10 years of a Conservative government that sought to undermine the integrity of the Supreme Court of Canada, the justice system in Canada, and indeed diminish Atlantic Canada as a region in our federation. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the Nadan reference previously. That case revolved around the attempted unconstitutional appointment of a Supreme Court justice. In that case, what made it worse is on the back end of the decision, the Conservative executive, the Prime Minister's office, was involved in a spat with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. She is a tremendous jurist that we are lucky to have in this institution. And instead of abiding by a decision that they disagreed with, which would have been the mature thing to do, they launched an adolescent spat to try to undermine the integrity of our most preeminent legal institution in our country, and they should be ashamed of themselves. Mr. Speaker, in addition to their disrespect for the Supreme Court of Canada, their attitude towards justice in Canada boggles my mind. What they've sought to do is spend millions of Canadians' taxpayer dollars to defend charter violations time and time again, which makes it hard to take criticism legitimately from the opposite side on how we're dealing with the Supreme Court of Canada. When it came to assisted dying legislation, they sought to ensure that the legislation the Supreme Court required would not get passed. When it came to protecting vulnerable people like drug addicts and sex workers, they sought to introduce criminal legislation that would make these people less safe, and the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, you are not allowed to do that. When it came to their attempts at Senate reform, the Supreme Court said, you're doing it wrong again. When it came to trying to deny full access to Aboriginal title to our Indigenous population in Western Canada in the Chilcotin case, the Supreme Court said no. When it came to a ban on medicinal marijuana on the basis that marijuana can't be a medicine that patients use, the Supreme Court said no. And when it came to introducing mandatory minimum sentence, the opposition, when they were in government, took the attitude that we're better positioned as legislators in Ottawa than a jurist sitting on the ground with the accused before them and a full access to a full body of evidence. I can't understand it. And again, the Supreme Court said no, that is not allowed. But it is not just the Supreme Court that they attacked. It was the justice system from top top to bottom. We need to look no further than their attempts to, again, spending taxpayer dollars to refuse the integration of Omar Khadr into Canadian society. When it came to the case of Ron Smith, they got tied up in litigation that was based around their refusal of diplomatic services to protect a Canadian who was on death row in another country. And Mr. Speaker, I apologize in advance if I get emotional about the next one, because it strikes home with me. They spent $1.4 million of Canadian taxpayers' dollars to deny health care benefits to refugees. I'm particularly emotional about this one, given the experience that my community has had in welcoming refugees to rural Nova Scotia on the Eastern Shore, in Pictou County, and in Antigonish. I feel compelled to draw your attention to one example, and it's now become my friends that had family in Antigonish. They ran a chocolate factory in Damascus that employed 30 people, and in a week they lost everything, a lifetime's worth of work to the war. When they landed in Nova Scotia with nothing but the goodwill of the community that welcomed them, they started from scratch, but they said, if we have to start from scratch, we're going to start today. And they started making chocolate in the basement of the home the community found for them. When they got their feet under them, they decided they wanted to give back, and when the wildfires broke out in Fort McMurray, they donated a month's worth of profits to the relief efforts in Fort McMurray. Mr. Speaker, these are not only the kind of people we should be welcoming as newcomers to Canada, but we should be aspiring to be as Canadians. While we welcomed them to our shores, the Conservatives, now in opposition, spent $1.4 million seeking to deny them access to a full range of health care benefits, and it was disgraceful. But, Mr. Speaker, continuing on the theme that it's hard to take this criticism legitimately, there's a latent narrative they're trying to push in the motion, that Atlantic Canada is not being effectively represented, despite that there are 32 strong Liberal MPs. You know what, I find it ironic. The Conservative Atlantic MPs have been silent on this, perhaps because there are none, because they don't speak to issues that matter to Atlantic Canadians. Since the election, we have been focused on growth in Atlantic Canada. We're constantly advocating for the rights of Atlantic Canadians and investment in the region. Just this summer, when the Prime Minister visited New Glasgow and 4,200 people came out to see him, we had announcements of $119 million in infrastructure, $75 million in affordable housing, and $50 million in small craft harbour. These investments create work in the short term, but lay the framework for economic growth in the long term, and that is what matters to Atlantic Canadians. But what excites me most is that these are not one-off investments. These are part of a strategy that was announced in July called the Atlantic Growth Strategy. And this strategy was not something that we campaigned on. It was not in our budget. It was a plan that was formed in direct response to the feedback of 32 Liberal MPs working with the government to ensure that the interests of our region are represented in the priorities of the government, and we are having success. This plan focuses on immigration, innovation, infrastructure, trade, and tourism. These are the priorities of the Atlantic caucuses that have made it into federal policy and will help Atlantic Canada grow. So it's difficult, after 10 years of watching them diminish my region economically by revamping EI that encouraged, their plan for Atlantic Canada was to encourage young people to move to Alberta. Mr. Speaker, the kinds of investments we're making is going to allow young people and families to stay in our region. I cannot stand here and listen to criticism either about the role of the Supreme Court of Canada or their supposed defense of Atlantic Canada after the record they had in government. I'm very pleased to stand up here knowing in my heart of hearts that we have been standing up for the rights of Atlantic Canadians, acting on their behalf. I will continue to act as an advocate within our caucus and in public for my region, because that is the job I was elected to do. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for North Okanagan-Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his speech. I want to take it back, and the question will also apply to this speech.